In a groundbreaking move, the UK is the first country to approve a CRISPR gene editing tool known as Casgevy for human diseases. This marks a new era of medicine in terms of treatment in having a actual gene editing therapy approved and licensed for humans. But is this good news or bad news? Let's talk about it. So for context, this is a gene editing therapy tool used for a particular blood disorder known as beta-thalassemia. And this is a disorder where the building blocks of hemoglobin, which is found in red blood cells, is not formed properly, and there is kind of a build-up and overload of this, causing massive problems long term. So naturally, with this type of anemia, there is no cure as of yet, but could this actual gene editing therapy be that cure? That's a interesting discussion. Just a caveat, as you can probably tell, I've not been feeling too well, but I thought this news was really important that I had to share. So sorry if I sound like Darth Vader, but hopefully this video will still be of benefit for you. So thank you for staying tuned. So CRISPR as a theory and as a tool has been around for some time, but in terms of being licensed and actually used to treat humans, that is something very new. But in terms of what CRISPR is, again, I'm not a geneticist, but essentially there are a molecular scissors, which is the enzyme called Cas9, and there is kind of the guide RNA that can tell the enzyme where to go in terms of to cut that particular part of a defective DNA that needs to go. Now, I'm just going to read out a statement from a particular article. Article's here, and the article is down below for proper referencing. But in this article, it says that Casgevy is designed to work by editing the faulty gene in a patient's bone marrow stem cells so that they could produce functioning hemoglobin. To do this, stem cells are taken out of the bone marrow, edited in a laboratory, and then infused back into the patient, after which the results have been potentially lifelong. And that leads me on to then looking at CRISPR in terms of the pros and cons for actual treatment in humans. With the good thing, I like my pudding first. Let's start with the good. Now, from a good perspective, you have to realize that a lot of these genetic disorders are lifelong. There is no cure, there is no drug that can actually solve the problem long term. You've got cystic fibrosis, you've got all sorts of neurological disorders, and you've got blood disorders like beta-thalassemia. So gene editing, and in particular CRISPR, can actually revolutionize the way we treat patients with those disorders. And it's bonkers to think that you can actually modify a human DNA form, and over time they can produce the correct protein that was a problem. In terms of this right now, it's the beta globulins, and potentially, in theory, could cure a disease that was essentially incurable for decades. That has to be a pro 100% from a medical point of view. However, there's always problems. Here are the cons. So for me, the cons fall into two categories. There is the kind of issues with regard to the technique itself, and then the actual ethical considerations about what would happen if this is now mainstream and widely used. Now, from a cons point of view, like with anything we do in research and science, we can, to the best of our ability, plan for what may or may not happen in terms of a drug being used. Here are the side effects, but there's still unknowns. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And if, even though you know, understand about, if you were to edit this gene, put it back in, you may be aware of X, Y, and Z. But there is so much that we don't know about gene editing as a licensed therapy in terms of the consequences long term for a person's genes, DNA, the proteins that are sequenced. Are there issues long term? What happens if you then start to go back and that mutation builds again? What happens? What happens to, you know, your genetic code? All sorts of things that may or may not happen, we are still unknown. So there's still so much that needs to be investigated and experimented to really confirm the safety of actual licensed gene editing therapies. But I feel the bigger con and the bigger concern and drawback is the ethical considerations about what happens then from a government and political perspective if gene editing is now able to be prescribed and, you know, endorsed for all number of conditions potentially in the next 10, 20 years. Now let me kind of set the scene with this. Who governs who is allowed to have gene editing therapy or not? What are the kind of governance from a safety point of view, as I mentioned with the biology kind of drawbacks? What are the costs? Who is allowed to take it, who isn't? If it's being done in one country, can other people come and take it? Because you got to remember, naturally, when there is any emerging trend that is revolutionary, there is always arguments and governmental, you know, debates and clashes, because that country or that particular city wants to be the one doing it, and all number of problems occur with issues like this. Say, for example, take COVID for example. when COVID came around, and then there was a whole battle and race from a pharmaceutical industry's perspective about getting vaccines out. You saw all number of countries hoarding excess supplies of vaccines, even though they didn't need it, and other countries were in dire need of it. I'm pretty sure and pretty guess that if gene editing becomes, widespread, which it might do in the next, couple of decades, I feel a lot of people will hide and hold and put behind patents and put behind red tape that these particular countries may be able to have it, these can't. So I do feel there's a lot of drawback from a gene editing law, from governance, from a political perspective, all the way down to the actual bare bones of the technique itself. Because you have to remember, once you invoke a permanent change to a genetic code in a cell, generally speaking, it will be permanent and it will affect all other cells that are going to be replicated or made from that. So we don't know, are there many generations when then the mutation changes again, or could that invoke another mutation that might be unavoidable? We don't know these things yet. So I am 100%, as a scientist and as a researcher, amazed at the ability we can now in terms of potentially curing things that were incurable. But I'm very concerned also about the ramifications about if this was to be utilized widespread. It is great news 100%, but I'm very concerned about, like we happened with COVID, the war that generally happens from a pharmaceutical industry's perspective when something revolutionary comes out. And I know it's going to happen with gene editing, but let's see what takes place. Now, in terms of the future of Casgevy, which is this particular gene editing CRISPR therapy used to treat beta-thalassemia, I'm interested from the US FDA. I'm just reading kind of my notes from the US FDA and the European Medicine Agency that are reviewing Casgevy. I do hope that there are approachable criteria to allow these patients to take it. But in terms of the future of this, I do think it'll get cheaper as you have more raw materials in order to do this, more laboratories and more hospitals are being able to do something like this. Like with anything, normally super expensive, and then over years it gets cheaper and cheaper. So I hope something like gene editing, just like immunotherapy, you got to remember immunotherapy was something not very widespread, but now many asthmatic, people with respiratory problems, cancer problems are now taking immunotherapy, and it's not widespread like paracetamol because it's obviously very expensive, not paracetamol, but immunotherapy. But I do think gene editing will probably follow that same suit. However, gene editing has way more health ethical considerations than immunotherapy. So I do think the future is exciting for gene editing therapies, but again, as I mentioned earlier, I am a lot more concerned with the problems as opposed to with something like immunotherapy. Now, to give a parable, think of, I kind of put gene editing in the bank of AI, because AI is revolutionary but has a lot of ethical considerations. Gene editing is also revolutionary but has proper ramifications that need to be addressed and managed and policed in a very good way. So yeah, maybe that could be the thumbnail, AI and gene editing. Anyway, that's me on this. To add, if you want to see some kind of latest news from a drug point of view in terms of potentially new highly selective anti-cancer drugs, I made a video about AOH1996. That link is here. Link is also in the video description down below. You enjoy that. Sorry for sounding really unwell. I'm gonna go have a rest now. Hopefully find that video useful. I shall see you in the next one. Take care.